This is Jeff Baker, and unlike most Americans, I've had the privilege of coming to Waco, Texas to find out firsthand for myself what really happened at the Branch Davidian complex in Waco, Texas. What you're about to see will be shocking and horrifying, but you need to know the truth. On February 28th, 1993, the government, under the auspices of Secretary of the Treasury Lloyd Benson and one of the departments that works for him, the department called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, conducted a raid on a little-known place just outside of Waco, Texas, known as the Mount Carmel Center or the Branch Davidian Church Retreat Center. And the events that took place from February 28th until April 19th, we saw the lives of about 86 Davidians snuffed out. 4 officers of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms were lost. In the events that followed since April 19th, we have seen one of the strangest trials, perhaps in the history of this nation. We have seen some of the strangest behavior by the media that I've ever witnessed. And yet, the evidence that all of us have sought for so long is still being somehow hidden. Do we really know what happened at Waco, Texas, at the Branch Davidian Church Retreat Center? Do we really know what the government did there? Well, I think some answers are beginning to come out. And I think today, that's what we're going to look at. That's what we're going to discuss. Now, I want to tell you in advance, some of what you see and some of what you hear may be shocking, may even be horrifying. But I think unless we learn the lessons of Branch Davidian, unless we walk away from the lessons that should be learned from that peaceful little place outside of Waco, Texas, America and life as we know it in this nation may forever be affected. So it is our intent today to look at Waco, triumph or treason. I'd like to introduce our expert panel of guests who have joined me today for this discussion. My first guest, Jack DeVault, U.S. Air Force retired. You were a major, as I recall.
That's right.
We're very glad to have you here. You, by the way, attended all but 2.5 days of the entire 6-week trial in Waco, Texas.
In San Antonio.
San Antonio, Texas,
Correct.
rather. Appreciate so much you taking time out of what I know has to be a busy schedule. I know you're also writing a book, which hopefully we'll touch on it a little bit too. Taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us for this program.
Pleasure to be here.
And my friend, Bruce Bent. Bruce, good to have you with us. Bruce is a man of absolute integrity. He is someone I consider an expert in common law and constitutional principles, historian, teacher, lecturer, author, and of course my friend Bruce Bent. Bruce, good to have you here.
Jeff, good to be here.
Fellas, this is undoubtedly one of the strangest events, I think, in U.S. history at least. We have seen perhaps the most bizarre act taken at least in recent memory by the government of the United States under the auspices of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. We saw the FBI join in. it is hard to imagine something more peculiar, more horrifying going on in the United States than what we have seen in the Branch Davidian fiasco. Almost 100 people died over an alleged weapons violation. We're going to get into all of this as we go through this strange story. We're going to be talking about what happened, why it happened, and where it's going from here. But I think first we need to lay a little bit of groundwork in this thing. As I mentioned, the lead agency in this was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, correct?
That's right. That's right.
Basically, it boils down to this. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms produces an affidavit, right, that says we need to get a warrant against David Koresh, also known as Vernon Wayne Howells. We need to get this warrant to go out there and search the premises, correct, ostensibly?
That's right.
I mean, the simple process. This happens a lot, right? I mean, this isn't something that's never happened before in the United States. People issue warrants, correct?
The warrant is the only means that a person can have for legally searching to find evidence of a crime.
BATF goes and they get some magistrate to sign a warrant of some sort. Who was that magistrate?
Magistrate Dennis Green.
Dennis Green. Now, when they say magistrate, what does that mean? What is a magistrate?
Well, I'm not sure that I can give you a good definition. It's a man who is able to certify papers for the court.
Okay. Anything, Bruce? Anything
That's
to add to that?
ostensibly correct.
Okay. So he's not a judge.
They address him as judge sometimes.
Okay.
He's generally not elected. He's generally appointed.
Okay. Who
By a
appointed?
judge.
Who appointed Magistrate Dennis Green?
Judge Walter S. Smith, Jr.
Judge Walter S. Smith, Jr. Now, that's a name we're probably going to hear again as we progress in this conversation, isn't it?
That's right.
Okay, so folks, keep that in mind now. This is a name that you're going to want to remember. This is somebody that you want to pay attention to because he's played very heavily into this thing. Now, they get this warrant to go down to Waco, Texas, just outside of Waco, Texas, the Mount Carmel Church Retreat Center, right? Run by the Branch Davidians. So the plans are made, I suppose, to what? Pack up a couple of guys, send them down there on an airplane, they rent a car, they go to the door, they knock, they say, we've got a warrant to look for a supposed AK-47 of some sort, or a 50 caliber machine gun, or 50 caliber gun of some sort. It seems to be a little disparity in exactly what they were looking for. But they ostensibly have got this warrant. They're supposed to go down, knock on the door, hand him the warrant. He's supposed to look at it and say, yeah, it's a warrant. Come in and search, right? I mean, isn't that what a warrant does? This wasn't a no-knock warrant or anything, was it?
This was not it did not specify no knock, no.
Okay. So that means you go, you tap on the door, you say, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. We're tax collectors. We think you've got a weapon in here that you owe some taxes on, right?
That's correct. Except it went much further than that. They also made allegations of these individuals being a cult, of child abuse, of brainwashing, of
Okay, now those are some interesting charges, aren't they?
especially for a tax collector.
Now, what is the division of Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, Child Abuse, and Strange Religious Beliefs, right? I mean, isn't that, no, they're
You would
Bureau of
think so.
Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I mean, is that correct? That's their job, that's all they do.
That's right.
So, any allegations, and by the way, this affidavit, the vast majority of the thing, I've read it, the vast majority of the thing deals more with child abuse and strange religious beliefs than it does with supposed gun violations.
That's correct.
Now,
In fact, that was the contention of Janet Reno through the whole thing. We're doing this to protect the children. Our concern is for the children. And we know how the final analysis came down.
That was only the public relations approach, however. At the trial, there was practically nothing said about child abuse. There was practically nothing said about any of these other allegations. The judge really restricted them from saying anything about it. They talked about other things. They talked about the charges.
well, and I think, too, the judge was wise in doing that, particularly if he was at all inclined toward the prosecution side of the issue, and we're going to talk about that later on when we get into the trial phase of this, but if he was at all inclined toward that, he would almost have to rule that, because if the BATF is involved, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is involved in investigating a child abuse case, their whole program is shot right now that fast, because they had no jurisdiction, right?
That's correct.
Let me stop you from where you are and go back to your assumption that the ATF agent should go knock on the door, because this particular attack was based far before February 28th. Davy Aguilera, who was the ATF agent who was in charge of the entire investigation prior to February 28th, had gone to a gun dealer who was doing business with David Koresh, and the gun dealer said, there's an ATF man here asking questions about your gun deals, and we'd like to send him on over there. The gun dealer then went to the telephone to call David Koresh, and Davy Aguilera said, no, don't tell him that. And this came out in evidence in the trial, because the plan had already been set.
Now, I've read some reports. In fact, I have read the Treasury Department report. I have read the House Subcommittee report. I have not read the Justice Department report, which I'm assuming is a separate report of some sort, but there's so many reports floating around on this thing that it's hard to keep up with it. All of them released quite late. In many instances, you can tell by identical wording in a couple of places that they have corroborated in many areas on this. I have read that this was planned as much as 3 years out in one of the reports. Almost all of the reports indicate that this was at least a year old. So here we've got the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms looking into a group of people that ostensibly had done nothing wrong to anyone. They had not threatened anyone. They had not been breathing out venomous threats against the government. They hadn't harmed any of their neighbors. BATF said they were involved in child abuse. The state of Texas said no. Sheriff Jack Harwell of Waco, Texas, said there's absolutely no proof. In fact, there's a piece of film we've got with him saying that, and we'll probably take a look at that. As we look at all of this information, it looks to me as if the BATF was in some way looking for an excuse to cowboy this thing up. Now remember the position the BATF is in. Their funding has gone down, has it not, every year for the past several years under Reagan Bush. They're not a popular agency. That is, they don't have a lot of charisma. They're threatened to be merged in with another organization. Funding's going down. Funding review is coming up shortly. Now, remember the fiasco they had just prior to this with Randy Weaver up at Ruby Creek. Now, again, I want to remind our viewers out there, this is what happened. They attacked him, said he was involved in illegal firearms trade, selling a sawed-off shotgun. Meanwhile, they surround his cabin. They put 4 bullets in his son's back. They killed his son's dog. They killed his wife from probably about 100 yards out with a sniper scope rifle while she was nursing a baby at the front door. Apparently they were afraid that the baby was loaded and might go off, because they put a bullet between her eyes from a range that any marksman with any savvy at all can hit. I can hit a tin can from that far away. Certainly with a laser scope, you can do about anything you want from that distance. They had just gone through this fiasco. If you recall, Randy Weaver was acquitted on all but the original gun charge, which of course he'll have to fight in court. He was acquitted of everything else, conspiracy to commit murder, all of that nonsense. Acquitted of all that. They've just had this major embarrassment. And now Waco, the chance to get some religious cultists who were molesting children, had strange religious beliefs, and hoarding guns. Sound familiar at all? Take it back again as you look through history. You see the common threads, exactly 50 years to the day. Nazi Germany, in the ghettos of the Nazi regime from Germany, in the ghettos of Warsaw, Poland, exactly 50 years to the day, stormed the Jews in that ghetto. Exactly 50 years to the day, April 19th, 1943, they burned them alive and shot whatever came out. We see again history repeating itself. Fellows, as you look at this, we've got to ask some important questions. is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Are they tax collectors or are they policemen? Because it makes a big difference in what they're doing. How is their job defined? Bruce, do you know?
It's interesting that in the footage that's been seen by many people now regarding the BATF raid on the Mount Carmel compound, that many of the individuals in that raid were wearing vests or shields or things like this that actually said BATF agent police. Police is an entirely different set of powers from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. These are individuals who are part of the Internal Revenue Service, a division of them for collecting the tax on those specific items. And that's the only authority that they have. They have no police powers. The situation is such now that I believe they've tried to turn that around, tried to present an entirely different image to the American people. And I think we'll, as we discuss this, we'll see that there's intent in wanting to put forth this ideology before the people.
Well, it gets stranger and stranger, too, as you begin looking at the circumstances here. We've got a tax due on a gun, right? I mean, that's basically it in the original allegation that I could see. In fact, it becomes even more bizarre when you understand that some of the guns that are described in this affidavit don't even exist. And one of those we're going to see a little bit later. It's not the exact weapon they describe, but it's a brother weapon of the one that they're talking about. So it's very, very similar to what we have. We're going to see that a little bit later. And the BATF, again, affidavit, they mentioned this machine gun that had some tax due on it, that they said was illegal. First of all, it doesn't exist, but then there's also a tax due on the thing if it does exist, because it's a taxable weapon. So they go down there, and do they knock at the door? Do they say politely, Mr. Koresh, we have a warrant to search your premises. We believe that you have a weapon here that is either illegal or has a tax due on it. Is that what happens?
It should have been the means. Should have been the position which the BATF took, but they didn't. This was a scaled, full-scale assault on these people's property.
What did the trials reveal on this?
The trials revealed that it had been planned to be a major assault. It was to be what they call a dynamic entry raid. As a matter of fact, one of the agents, Special Agent Kenneth King, who's an 18-year veteran and a veteran of the Marine Corps, had been on one of the roof teams. There were two roof teams that took ladders, raced up to the roof so as to be at the roof windows at the same time that the people arrived at the front door. Kenneth King had a Sig Sauer pistol, he had machine guns, he had shotguns in his crew of 4. One of his men was killed up there, but we don't know what killed him. We don't know whether it was friendly fire. But anyhow, their plan involved throwing in a flash grenade, a percussion grenade to stun anyone that was inside the window, and to then make this dynamic entry. He was asked on the witness stand what he would have done if David Koresh had come to the front door and said, I surrender. What do you want me to do? He said, it wouldn't have made a bit of difference. We had our plan, and we were to follow it. They were to throw in a percussion grenade. They were to make an entry into the window and shoot anybody in the room that had a weapon.
You see, the desire was, supposedly, according to the warrant, that they were looking for this weapon. They were looking for proof that these people had a weapon, which was an illegal weapon. Not really. It was a totally legal weapon as long as the tax was paid on it. But they were looking for this weapon. And if you look at the pictures of the Mount Carmel compound, they could completely circle it with their 100 agents and never attack anybody. And there's no way anybody could escape with this piece of evidence that they were there to acquire.
In the initial reports that came out of Waco, Texas, we saw that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms intended, apparently, to go in this place shooting. They never seemed to have anything else in mind. Jack, you brought up an interesting perspective. One of the agents at the trial said that they were going to go in and make a dynamic entry, no matter what. Is that correct?
They couldn't do it any other way under their plan.
That means if David Koresh, all the women, all of these little children would have come out, raised their hands and said, we give up, The percussion grenades were still going to go off. The windows were still going to be bashed in. The shots were still going to be fired. No matter what, they were going in this place just like they had planned.
That's what Kenny King, ATF agent, testified at the trial.
Bruce, what does this say about the intent of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in this whole process?
Well, that the warrant and the use of the warrant was entirely bogus. There was no desire to serve properly a warrant. The desire was to create a raid. The warrant was just to give some facility of legality to their invasion of these people's property. There can be no other way of looking at it. In the United States, now if this had been communist Russia or some other country, we might look at it in a different light. But in the United States, a person's property, their liberty, their rights could not be violated without due process of law. These things are, that's the American way of looking at things. We've begun to acquire a different way of looking at things now, and we need to realize that that's what's happening, and that's what was shown here at Waco.
So we've got a warrant issued on a gun that may or may not exist, on a tax that may or may not be due. We have a bunch of cowboys running around Waco, Texas, the Mount Carmel Church Retreat Center. These guys are not going to knock on the door and say, Mr. Koresh, we have a warrant to search this premises. No matter what else happens, they are going to bust into this place, shouting, shooting, and screaming. They are locked and loaded and ready to go when they get there.
It was obvious that that was the plan because David Koresh had told his gun dealer friend to send the people on out and let him inspect everything that he had.
Okay, now, additionally, we heard from the media reports that these agents showed up and there was just a hail of gunfire. I mean, it was just a storm of gunfire. Now, in viewing this footage and looking at the footage, I, like you, can see these gentlemen, if you will, these agents or police, whatever they are, standing behind their cars. They're firing. In the first place, they've got no acquired targets, which is commanded for them. They have to have an acquired target. They don't have acquired targets. Their only target is anything that moves or anything that isn't moving. I mean, you can see them. Look at they're blasting away. They're shooting at everything that moves.
Well, the cameras clearly showed the whole front of the building. There was no one visible other than possibly a small child at the beginning of the raid. But the rest of the time, there's nobody visible. There was a door ajar at the front door, but all of the shells were coming from outside.
Yeah, did you notice that too? That all of the bullets flying are going one direction because here the BATF agents are standing here and no dust is being kicked up around them. Holes aren't suddenly appearing all over the cars. I mean, I'm not seeing car windows shattering. I'm not seeing windshields being blown out. All I'm seeing is cowboys blasting away at this building with no targets of any kind.
That's right, and the story of that front door is real interesting because at the trial, they had one of the front doors with bullet holes going both ways through the door. But one of the doors was missing, and that was the door that Attorney Jack Zimmerman, one of the witnesses, said was peppered with bullet holes from the outside. It was the one through which Koresh had stepped when he first went out to greet the people coming in the pickup truck pulled trailers.
Now, it's interesting, too, because as you look at the footage again, I know that these were metal doors, but you still would have sprayed the paint. The pattern looks different for a bullet coming this way than it does for a bullet going that way.
Absolutely.
You notice these holes, listen, I'm not a great marksman, I don't pretend to be, but I can tell you which direction a bullet was traveling when it hit a door because I know how bullets react. Going in, it makes a small hole. Coming back out, it makes this chafing hole. Even on a metal door, it has a tendency to splinter and spread it. You can clearly see by the film footage that this was going in, not out. So, again...
And even as Jeff brought up, the situation with the door, even providing the door at a later date, doesn't show the initial firing of what took place at the opening moments of this raid. You know, whether or not the Branch Davidians were actually sitting, and that's the whole thing. The charges against these people were conspiracy to commit murder.
You're overlooking one very important fact. There were several pieces of evidence that should have been introduced that were not. There was no explanation for the missing door. One person said it burned up in the fire. That is
one
the
door, but
door
not
that
the
had
other one,
many,
right?
many bullet holes going in.
Sitting side by side, one burned up in a fire.
Yes. And they brought out an identical door that had gone through the middle of the fire, even if it had been pushed into the building and burned in there. They pulled one metal door out, and it was perfectly intact. It was visibly a door, and they could not find the other half of the double front door.
You know, I've heard of Grimm's fairy tales, but I think this is a grim fairy tale, the way it's shaking out, because so much of this stuff, just all of the government testimony seems to contradict all of the film footage that we've seen. Now, let's move on to another important point. Under the United States Code, Title 18, it's illegal to use the United States military in an action against the civilian population of the United States.
The Posse Comitatus Act.
Okay? However, as you begin again looking at the film that we've got, looking at the actual evidence of on scene, it is very, very clear, at least to me, that there was active military present, involved, in fact, in some areas, key to this to this raid, from the planning stage through the operation itself and then the cover-up behind.
The testimony at the trial even identified some of the people that were shipped there from MacDill Air Force Base, as a matter of fact, to assist in this operation.
Now, does that have to do anything with the Delta Force? They mentioned numerous times in both the tapes and in some of the special reports that came out before they began being edited, you know, because the coverage changed from the initial coverage. The initial coverage, we saw the paper reports that said the BATF came in and they were shooting and blazing. It didn't say they were being fired back on. It said they came in guns a-blazing. Of course, now the reports got altered later, but in some of the initial reports we found out, we heard military had been involved in planning this and all of this. Those were later squelched and that disappeared from the line. Well, what does this say, gentlemen, to us as citizens? If they're willing to take the United States military to go down on a warrant, not for arrest, but for search, a warrant to search a property, a peaceful warrant, to use a Delta Force type team to plan a dynamic entry invasion, a military-style operation on men, women, children, and babies.
In a church home.
In a church home.
Using 3 military helicopters in that raid, and then bringing in, I think it was 16 total armored vehicles, Bradleys and tanks, to surround them, to attack them finally after 51
Does that
days.
send the chill up your spine that it does mine?
Oh, definitely. You know, this is the same kind of a thing that we were warned about by our founding fathers when they said the whole reason that they didn't want to have a standing army was for this very reason. In the Federalist Papers, it was pointed out that standing armies were injurious to private liberties. And they said the best means of keeping those liberties intact was to see to it that the government didn't have a need to raise a standing army. So they put in the provision that a militia would be utilized consisting of the people of the United States, so the government wouldn't have the pretext of going and trying to assemble an army. They said that was a better prohibition than anything they could put on paper. And so the idea was to have a well-regulated militia, and then they went on to say that if the militia was there and armed, and the government ever did put forward a military to come against the people of the United States, the militia would be there ready to defend their rights in that instance.
But
It's a shame we don't
now,
have
of
them
course,
today.
if you talk about militia, you're talking lunacy for most people. Interesting, and we'll talk about this more just a bit later, but interesting, in the state of Florida, it is now mandatory that you are a part of the militia.
It's very revealing.
It looks to me, Bruce, that if America saw what really went on down there, if they had an opportunity to really see this, that somebody, most Americans, would have to, Jack, stand up and say, my God, what is this insanity?
If they could see what had happened on that 51st day of the siege and saw how the FBI attacked that building with tear gas and with their tanks and destroyed the building, driving everyone into the center concrete block room in that building.
Talk to me a little bit more about that, because, you know, the question is often asked, why didn't the people just come out? Now, of course, we've got some film footage that we're going to show that shows why the people didn't do that. But before we get to that film footage, we'll do it right after this, but tell me more about that, driving them, because this is some stuff that we haven't heard before. They're driving them to the center of the building?
Well, you see, the persons that did escape the fire were out on the wings in the periphery of the building. They were far on the north end of the building or far on the south end of the building. And the only safe place in the building left was this concrete cold storage room in the very center. That was where the 4-story tower was. The women and children had gone to that place. The only other possible place to go was the underground buried school bus down at the other end. But that was the first place the tank had crushed the access
That's
to.
what they call the bunker.
That's what some people call the bunker.
There's actually 2 places called the bunker, which makes it a little confusing.
That's very confusing. But this cold storage room was in the center of the building, concrete block structure, and that is where everybody went. It was also where the arms were kept, the spare rifles and so forth. But that place was full of the bodies of women and children at when they were discovered there. And all of the building, all around, had collapsed. They had fired in this CS gas, which is instantly incapacitating.
By the way, an interesting little tidbit we'll discuss. This is a shell used, ladies and gentlemen, to fire CS gas. It is a 40-millimeter shell. This is the box that CS gas comes in. I found these out at Branch Davidian, out at Waco. Apparently the government didn't do a very thorough cleanup job. They left a number of these lying around. Brings us to another interesting point that maybe we'll get to. Why, if they were firing these 40-millimeter shell mortar rounds into the building from 1/5 of a mile away, did they need tanks to pump in CS gas? They were pumping in the CS gas from 1/5 of a mile away. What were the tanks really pumping in? You brought up an interesting point to me. You happen to know a little something about these tests. Tell our audience about that.
In most basic training situations in the military, the people are put through a gas chamber which contains CN gas, which is a powerful irritant. But I've been told that CN gas is only 1/10 as disturbing and as powerful as CS gas, which is incapacitating instantly. Your eyes close involuntarily. The manufacturer's warning label says that it may be lethal within 8 minutes if prolonged exposure is
now, within
experienced.
8 minutes, how long did the government say they pumped in the CS gas?
Something like 6 hours.
6 hours. Now, the manuals on this stuff say, don't use it in an enclosed area.
That's correct.
What else does the manual say on it?
Well, the manual says don't use where innocent women or children might be exposed to it, or any innocent persons might be exposed to it. It also says it is to be used only when a riot is in progress or is imminent. Those are the instructions
These
in the
folks
manual.
didn't look like they were rioting much, but it also says never in an enclosed area.
Correct.
Because there's no ventilation, you'll die from the stuff. Besides that, folks, imagine the size mortar that must come off a 40-millimeter shell. Imagine the size of the projectile coming off of this thing. That alone can kill you if it hits you. So this stuff is being, by the way, again, we've got this discrepancy. The tanks were pumping in CS gas supposedly for 6 hours. But these were being fired from 1/5 of a mile away. They're all around the sniper positions, built all around the place. You've seen the film footage of the sniper positions. They're there.
They were being fired from the Bradley vehicles that were running around. They were equipped to fire this with, I believe they called it an M70 launcher, and they fired, I believe, 190 rounds of this into the building during that 6 hours.
The snipers are shooting it. The Bradley vehicles are shooting it. The CEVs are pumping this stuff in. These people are absolutely incapacitated. In fact, I wish I had the newspaper along. I don't. I would like to show the clip from it. But one of the, in fact, several of the papers, I picked it up this off the news services. It said, speaking of this CS gas and the effects on these children, it said their last hour must have been a final hell, knowing what this does to young lungs, young bodies, just absolutely destroying them.
People were clumped together in this little concrete bunker with their eyes sealed shut by that stuff, with the building collapsing upon them, and with fire starting.
Can you imagine the horror, Jack?
I can't imagine.
Can you imagine, Bruce, the horror? People are dying. People, the bodies are being fused together. The building is being collapsed on them from the back. The tanks then move around to the front and start caving in the building on women and children in the center of this building where they've been herded. Again, we ask the question, why didn't they come out? We've seen the film footage now that tells us they couldn't. When they would try and come out, the percussion grenades would go off. The snipers would start the shooting. The concertina wire, which is that razor wire, is all around this compound area that they've created for these people, that they've driven them into. You see, it started our church retreat center, became then a compound as they wired it off and drove them into it. We deal with the poison gas. By the way, Bruce, you mentioned to me, we signed a treaty concerning this, January 1993. What did it say?
It said that that the CS gas was actually so lethal and so deadly that we would not even use it in combat warfare.
So it's a battlefield chemical warfare weapon.
That has been excluded from battlefield warfare use.
By
our government's agreement in international treaty.
And if I'm not mistaken, 130 signatories to that. In other words, we won't use this stuff, folks, on Saddam Hussein, but we'll use it on 86 men, women, and babies at Mount Carmel Church Retreat Center. Stunning to me, the depths to which we have sunk. But before that happened, we decided to have a little sport with those inside. Decided to try out some of our techniques. There's some film footage I want you to see because this is a psychological warfare operation. It's a short piece of film, guys. When we come back, I want to talk about it, but I want America to see what went on at Branch Davidian, at the Church Retreat Center there, what they were subjected to while they were waiting for the final fiery outcome of what became the Branch Davidian affair under the auspices of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the FBI, Mr. Sessions, Mr. Higgins, Janet Reno, and this whole lot. Let's look at this film and then we'll come back.
The FBI tortured the Branch Davidians with bright lights and loudspeakers blasting the sounds of rabbits being slaughtered in Tibetan monk chants. As this tape from the BBC reveals, various psychological weapons were available to the Justice Department.
2 Russian psychologists have been brought in from Moscow to demonstrate a technique for analyzing the human mind and then influencing it. The concept is that with an understanding of an individual's mind, key words transmitted in music or white noise will force that person to obey. The FBI examined the system to use against David Koresh at Waco in Texas.
It's amazing to me, gentlemen, that our own government would use these kinds of tactics, even bringing in foreign agents, to look, to examine, to seek out ways to hurt and destroy these people. This was supposed to be, again, remember, a peaceful warrant service. A knock on the door, Mr. Koresh comes to the door, he answers the door, they hand him a warrant, they come in, they look around. They confiscate a weapon if it's wrong, they even perhaps arrest him and charge him with holding an illegal firearm. But this? Bruce, what does this say to America about government? What does this say to America about people like Janet Reno or about people like Lloyd Benson or Bill Clinton who would allow these things.
So we send people to government, or that's the understanding that most Americans have, that we send people to government to be people who will serve the American public in the preservation and the security of their rights. That those individuals are sent there with a job to do, and that they are to do that job lawfully under the direction that we gave them as in the contract we call the Constitution. And that contract spells out very clearly the things they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. The things we've been looking at here are clearly things that no person operating in the sphere of government today is authorized to do, has never been authorized to do, and hopefully never will be authorized to do. The question is whether we as the people of the United States will begin to realize that the only way that our liberties are preserved is when we understand, and that those people that we send to represent us have to understand that contract and be willing to abide by it. And if they aren't, we're going to have to find some means of lawfully taking charge of putting them on trial for conspiring to do away with our rights, conspiring to do away and to murder the people of the United States. That's what really should have been on trial here.
And quite honestly, it's frightening to me as well that this whole thing began in the first place as a firearms violation. Again, ladies and gentlemen, listen to Article 2 of the Bill of Rights, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people, not government, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Infringed means to alter, shorten, or to touch in any way that right. It is an unalienable right, not a constitutional right, a right unalienable that is guaranteed by the Constitution. Let's move quickly on to the day of the fire itself, the last day of this siege, April 19th, 1993. First, the government had been carrying on this illegal military operation. They had not properly served a warrant. They went in shooting. They went in banging. My question is this, because there's been a lot of controversy about who started the fire. So before we even get into that, let's ask the question. If the government had not maliciously, malignantly gone down to Branch Davidian, Mount Carmel Church Retreat Center, firing like madmen, putting this place under siege, would there ever have been a fire of any kind to kill these people?
No.
Bruce?
No.
So really, who started the fire becomes almost a moot point, doesn't it? Because the government, by their very presence there, started the fire. Whether they physically started the fire or not, they were responsible.
Absolutely, but I wouldn't give them credit for it being in question. They started the fire.
Okay, again, let's look at some footage, because I think this is very, very important. You'll notice as the tape begins, these are the, quote, rescue tanks, end quote, that are going in to help the people. You notice as the tank withdraws, you begin to see what appears to be flame coming up the front of the tank. Meanwhile, it continues to collapse more and more of this structure. Interestingly, there is no fire anywhere visible until the time when the tanks begin to go to work. The fire slowly progresses as the tanks do more and more of their dastardly deeds. This tank is caving in yet another portion of the building. Remember, these are government rescue tanks. As you look at the footage here again, you'll see the smoke begin to billow out as a tank comes roaring out the side of the building. Fortunately, these were rescue tanks. Unfortunately, every place these rescue tanks went, we seem to see smoke and flames billowing immediately after their withdrawal. Meanwhile, the structure is becoming more and more uninhabitable as the people are herded again like human cattle to the center section of this building from which there is no escape. Notice also that the fire is progressive. It starts in small spaces, proceeds to other parts of the building and their center until finally it is nothing but a blazing, raging inferno. All the time, remember, Janet Reno had to go in to protect these children. The question is, protect them from what? None of them had ever been burned to death before their encounter with her. Meanwhile, as you can see, the flames are billowing. The smoke is becoming thick. This is absolutely uninhabitable. Meanwhile, the tanks continue to push debris in on the fire, making it hotter and hotter. Obviously, nothing, neither man nor beast, could survive an inferno like this. But again, remember, fortunately, these are rescue tanks. The government was going in to help people. Listen carefully to the comments of the individual who recorded this tape. I think you'll find the words striking and shocking.
Here we see evidence that the concrete bunker where all the women and children's bodies were found is being flamed back up. The wood from the structure has been pretty much gone for quite some time. As you can see, it's after 1 o'clock, and the fire started somewhere around noon, and they're flaming that bunker back up. All that is a concrete bunker with a walk-in cooler inside. So what the heck is going on here?
Folks, you've seen the tapes. They are both shocking and horrifying. Gentlemen, you have seen the tapes as well. A simple question: who started the fire at Branch Davidian in Waco, Texas?
It's a joint effort. The FBI, the BATF, the Texas State Law Enforcement, and all those who conspired with them to terminate the lives of these people. There can be no other conclusion.
It was amazing to me that there was official inside criticism of the ATF for their part in the raid, but nobody bothered to criticize the FBI. I think that the FBI was probably the prime mover in making that come off. They could have backed off at any time during that siege. They could have taken another tactic. I would put the primary responsibility on the FBI and Janet Reno and William Sessions. But as you say, the whole group share the responsibility.
And the United States Army, and that's a very telling point, because
It's a
the
very
United
frightening
States
point,
Army
too.
is never to be utilized against the United States people. They have no law enforcement capability. They are there for destruction. They are there for warfare.
What is it?
This was declared
A
warfare.
popular talk show host says they're in there to kill people and break things.
That's
That's
right.
it. The question's got to be asked. One person was potentially guilty. Why didn't they take one person instead of besieging?
And they had plenty of opportunities.
Fact, unfact? Not true. What is it?
Absolutely true. There were at least 126 innocent people in that building that were attacked unlawfully under color of law.
They could have had David Koresh anytime they wanted him. From reports I've gotten, from people I've talked to, he was off the compound almost daily, what they called the compound. And again, I use that word in quotes because, frankly, it bothers me a little bit. It was a church retreat center that somehow got called a compound. Well, I guess it was a compound. When you surround it with concertina wire and do what they did to it, it does become a compound or a concentration camp. They could have had Koresh at any rate, whatever they wanted him. He was off within 2 days before the raid. So the problem was not having access to him. The final question for this segment before we move on. Under Texas law, did these people have a right to defend themselves?
Most certainly.
We've seen the footage on that as well. It's interesting, isn't it, that under Texas law, if they're met with undue force like this, that they have a right to defend themselves.
Even in the legitimate service of a warrant.
Even in the legitimate service of a warrant,
If there's
if
undue
in
force.
fact this kind of unnatural force, and I would say that going to a church with a warrant and bringing with you 100 plus men is at least adequate force, but when they come in screaming, throwing percussion grenades and firing weapons at will and at random, by the way, in violation of their own internal policies, saying that they have to have an acquired target, just randomly blasting anything that moved or didn't move, just blasting through doors. I would say that's undue force, wouldn't you? Unreasonable force?
Yes, sir.
So we've criticized them roundly here. What do we do?
We're going to continue talking about Branch Davidians, the dead and the living, but we're going to move specifically to the trial phase of the Waco saga. We have examined the horrors of what happened from February 28th to April 19th, but those horrors, as bad as they are, could have at least been mollified in some way had the court cases come out a little bit differently. So they went down, they got the trial. Who was the judge in the case down there?
Judge Smith was the judge who was responsible for the appointment of the magistrate. He was...
Now, when you say the magistrate, you're talking
I'm
about
talking about Magistrate
Green?
Dennis Green, who was the signer of the search warrant that Davy Aguilera took to him. It's difficult to go into all of the matters that went in to that search warrant, but it was obvious that from the time from the investigations beginning, the plan was to make a dynamic entry raid on the Mount Carmel complex.
Okay. Now, it was, well, I was going to ask you if that was brought out in the trial, but I'm going to get ahead of myself if I do, so let's hang on to that for just a minute. Bruce, you look like you had something you wanted to jump in here with.
You know, it's always a concern when people are being prosecuted for any criminal offense that our society has looked at and said these people have rights, and these rights can't be trodden down. And one of those rights, especially dealing with criminal prosecutions, as Jeff has brought out already, came from the Sixth Amendment. And that is the idea that the right was not only to the individual, but the right was also to the society, to where the crime was committed, and especially the idea that it was a criminal offense, it was something that affected the society. And so therefore they would have a part in seeing to it that that which was the laws that they had to live under would be prosecuted in the area in which they lived. And that was the idea behind the Sixth Amendment, the trial having to take place in the district where the crime was committed, not outside that district, somewhere else. And the idea was not that, the understanding of the Founding Fathers was that they couldn't get a fair trial somewhere else, because the people who were knowledgeable about the situation would be those people who were closest to the activities that took place. And somebody could come forward then if they've realized that information was not happening, because the trial was also to be public. All of these things seem to have been turned around, weren't they?
Now that, of course, takes us back to the whole problem that we talked about before, the absolute media control of
Yes.
what happened at Mount Carmel and Branch Davidian. I mean, there were no positive reports from day one. These people were being called cultists, religious nuts, the whole gamut of things. Every pejorative term that you can think of was thrown at them.
It's interesting because it's in a society where we're supposed to hold high the virtue or the value that a person is innocent until proven guilty. It's funny how that has turned so far around in our day and age that it's no longer, probably Waco is one of our key examples right now of how that has turned.
But Bruce, it's even more than that, though, because as you look at law today, you'll see that under the drug laws, under the money laundering laws, most of these laws, the police can now haul you in, take everything you've got, and put you in a position to have to go to court to prove yourself innocent of a crime for which in over 80% of the cases that these laws are used in, the people have never been charged. So again, we find ourselves in a situation where the advent of a police-type state is quickly coming upon us. Because we have discussed so much in detail of the events of Waco, because we have talked so much of frankly, what appears to be blatant, well-planned, cold-blooded murder down at Mount Carmel, it's difficult then to look at a trial like this, because obviously from my perspective, the first thing I would look at is, I would say, the law was broken in so many cases, where are the lawbreakers? That is, the agents, the police that came down there. Shocking to me that these are the folks not on trial, but nonetheless, we deal with what we've got. Judge Smith was the judge. You talked about his being responsible for the appointment of Magistrate Dennis Green. Dennis Green used him as a mentor, or
Dennis Green was the responsible agent for all of the documents that were signed to indict the Branch Davidians.
Okay.
Out of the 6-week trial, I think I missed a total of 2.5 days. Judge Smith was not jovial. Opening day was January 10th, and on that day, jury selection, serious jury selection, started. Actually, the jury selection had been going on in Judge Smith's office and in his mind for some time, because he had sent out a lengthy questionnaire to 300 persons selected from the Southern Texas jury wheel, which involves 13 counties of South Texas.
let me interrupt you just. You said he sent out a 22-page questionnaire. What was the bulk of this thing? Was it trying to find out if somebody was against blacks, or was it trying to find out if somebody was understanding of the basic tenets of the Constitution, or?
The report is that it was largely religious questions, although we have tried in vain up to now to get hold of a copy of that questionnaire so that we can examine it more closely. I understand that at the jury questioning itself, they also ask a number of questions about guns in addition to the religious questions in the jury selection process. So I kind of suspect that guns were mentioned on the
Jack, when you say religious questions, what do you, this was at the trial? This is as the judge was questioning?
On January 10th and January 11th, the judge asked the jury questions. Now, normally during voir dire, as they call it in Texas, the defense attorneys and the prosecuting attorneys asked the questions. But in this case, they were only allowed to submit the questions to the judge, and the judge asked the questions.
Wait a minute. I've never heard of such a thing before. Is this common practice? I mean, maybe I'm missing something.
I may be missing something too. I've never seen it done that way, but that's the way it was done there.
So let's do a little summation here. So far, the trial is moved from the district where the event happened. The judge is the same fellow that handpicked the magistrate that signed the document that said that they could go out there in the first place. And then you've got a judge who asks all the questions of the jury and selects which media can attend. What about the right to a public trial, Bruce?
I think it's important to look even at the, this whole question. According to the New York Times of January 10th, they said that Judge Smith asked 300 prospective jurors to fill out a 22-page questionnaire on their religious beliefs. According to the New York Times, and that's the only, that's period, that's end of sentence. These 6 reporters who were allowed in were Howard from the New York Times was one of those, and he says that this is Sam Howe, Verkauer. He reports that that 22-page questionnaire had taken the jury selection from 300 individuals down to 56. And that as the thing opened up, now I've seen 2 other reports, one listed as low as 42. Jack, I believe you said how many your understanding was?
My understanding from one of the attorneys was that the initial cut from the questionnaire was 84. There were 84 called for the January 10th jury selection period out of the 300.
So regardless, if it goes all the way to 42, that's more than 85% have been weeded out by the judge prior to the time that anybody participates in any of the jury selection whatsoever by a religious questionnaire of 22 pages. This is almost unheard of in the land where we're supposed to have freedom of religion, and where religious questionnaires were not to be the means for determining the fitness of an individual.
What he was looking for, perhaps, was to find somebody that would have I mean, I'm just assuming that he wouldn't want a Seventh-day Adventist on there.
No.
He wouldn't want a secret Davidian to be on there.
Who was on there, Jack?
We don't know the religious preferences. We know that the panel was made up of 13 men and 13 women and 5 men. Now, 6 of those 18 were alternates, and of the jury panel itself, the 12 which ended up making the decision, there were 8 women, 4 men. There were 8 Hispanics and 4 Caucasians. Now this is significant too, because 2 of the defendants were black, and there were no blacks chosen for jury duty. Now under most circumstances, somebody would cry discrimination. Nobody said anything here about discrimination.
Well, they just saw what happened in Waco. They aren't going to take any chances.
Have the names of the jurors ever been released?
They have never been released.
Okay. Now, again, an unusual situation where you've got the jury that is held confidential as if it were a mob trial and they feared for their lives or something like that. While I don't agree with it, at least you can see some reasoning behind it. The Davidians were all dead, except the few on trial. I mean, what was the reason for secrecy? This seems bizarre to me.
There was an effort to get the Fully Informed Jury Association involved in putting their literature into the hands of all of the potential jurors. And Judge Walter S. Smith, Jr. was determined not to allow that to happen.
Now, just in 30 seconds, what is the Fully Informed Jury? Is it?
The Fully Informed Jury Association is a 5-year-old organization that is trying to establish in state constitutions all over the country the fact that the jury has the right to make judgments based on their understanding of the law and whether the law is properly being applied in this case. And they can even judge the law itself as to whether the law was an appropriate law.
Now that, by the way, has been in several Supreme Court decisions. So this is nothing new. This dates back a long, long time. It's surprising to me.
No, but like these other provisions, a lot of these things have eroded over the years, and they now no longer have the same definitions they did before. It's not that the wording of the Constitution has been altered. It's not that the document has been tampered with. It's that the understanding that has been given to the American people is that they cannot comprehend what the Constitution says, what these rights are that they have, and the only one who can determine it is the 9-panel Supreme Court of the United States.
The charges that were brought against these people, murder, that's going to be tough to prove. In fact, the state found that very difficult to prove, didn't they?
That's right.
Was anybody convicted of murder?
No one was convicted of murder.
Okay. Conspiracy to commit murders. It appears to me to be a rather bizarre charge for something that happened during a, quote, surprise, end quote, raid. How can you conspire to murder somebody when they're supposedly coming at you with a surprise attack?
This is one of the few occasions when I felt Judge Walter Smith reacted fairly, because he instructed that jury to not consider a plan to defend oneself, plotting together to defend oneself against an attack as a conspiracy to commit murder. And this was what the prosecution pled for. They wanted this above all. They wanted that instruction not in the jury instruction.
Jack, we need to talk a little bit more about the defendants in the case, some of the people that the government brought charges against. It seems almost bizarre to me that, if I understand this correctly, 3 of the people that were charged with conspiracy were not even on the property at the time this whole thing took place. Is that accurate?
That's precisely correct. 2 of them were at the shop area where they repaired cars and lawnmowers and things like this, about 6 miles away. They also received mail there for their gun business, and they called it, for mail purposes, the mag bag, and that's of course what the government called it throughout the trial. But they called it the shop. And there were 3 people over there. 2 of them were tried. The other one was killed on the day of the raid.
Mm-hmm.
How was he killed on the day of the raid?
Well,
At the shop?
Not at the shop. They called up from the shop 6 miles away to the house, to the Mount Carmel Center, and they were told that we're under a raid over here. We're having trouble. And this was about noon. So these 3 men that were at the shop started making their way to Mount Carmel Center. This took them until about 5 that evening, and of course this was wintertime. It was beginning to get dark at that time. They approached from the backside. One of them was shot, one of them was captured, and one of them ran away. The one that ran away was captured about a week later. The one that was not shot was captured at that time, turned himself in. The one that was shot, there's an entire story about that, because I believe that that one was murdered. I believe he was wounded and then shot in the head after he was wounded, up close.
In looking at all of this, Norman Allison, his sentence was, the verdict on him was
He was not guilty.
not guilty. Woodrow Kendrick,
Not guilty.
Paul Fatta,
Paul Fatta was found guilty of conspiracy to manufacture weapons that were not properly licensed by the ATF. He could get as much as a 30-year sentence, I believe, out of this.
30-year sentence. Now, it wasn't even at the plate. Does this sound at all to you like a vendetta? Like, we charged him with something, and by George, something's going to stick one way or another.
8 out of the 11 that were on trial are still in jail. After having spent 1 year there since the fire, they're still in jail. Those 8 are awaiting sentence right now. They will get anywhere from 5 to 30 years on the charges on which they're being held, depending on what Judge Smith does.
Okay, the whole trial situation here, the whole trial scene. A lot of evidence was suppressed, it looks like.
There were 122 witnesses called by the government. Of those witnesses called by the government, none of the people who were responsible for the raid were called. None. 0.
They didn't want them testifying, afraid of what would come out under cross-examination? Or?
We can't say why they did it, but I'm certain that, I'm satisfied in my own mind that they just didn't want the raid investigated. What's interesting about this is that the raid and the killing of the death of those 4 officers was the whole reason for the trial, and yet the judge allowed evidence of the siege which followed and the fire to be entered. Now, he could have said, we don't want to discuss that here. My feeling is that Janet Reno and the whole establishment wanted that discussed here as if pretending to air it, and it wasn't aired. It was not given adequate inspection by the public at all.
Again, we see this cover-up. From what I understand now, the Treasury Department report, the House Subcommittee report, the Justice Department report, all 3 of these were quashed in the trial. They weren't allowed to be used. Some of the obvious conflicts in the story that the BATF, the FBI were telling were uncovered in there. Some of the lies were exposed, quite by accident, because many of the things just conflicted with what had been said. That too thrown out at Judge Smith's behest?
Well, it's hard to say what Judge Smith had in his mind. He, on rare occasions, came through looking like a very fair judge. But at the conclusion of the trial, my decision was that this had been a rigged trial, a rigged jury, rigged evidence. The whole thing was a fraud on the American people.
What about those that testified for the government? Were they honest, upright men, or were they basically liars, thieves, scoundrels, and downhill from there?
I'm glad you asked that, because that was extremely interesting to me. I felt like most of the Texas Rangers that testified were attempting to tell the truth. They wanted to be fair and honest. And they, of course, are the ones that should have investigated any problem in Texas, in that area, that was a state law violation. But incidentally, all of those Texas Rangers were sworn in as U.S. Marshals prior to the investigation, so that all of their testimony was done as a U.S. Marshal, because they were deputized by the United States as they were brought into this picture. One of the witnesses that most impressed me was the expert on firearms. His name was an FBI Special Agent James A. Cadigan. Now, Mr. Cadigan took the stand, and he was the most professional witness I've ever seen. But he was so professional that he looked deceptive, spoke deceptively. Everything that he said was suspect because he was so professional in his attitude. But he was the firearms expert from the FBI. He said that, yes, I know what a hydroshock bullet looks like, and this, he described it. It's a small 9mm cartridge that they were using, and it has a hole in the center with a peg down that center. The defense attorneys, in their attempt to cross-examine him, asked what this particular slug does and why it was adopted by the ATF and the FBI as their 9mm cartridge. He said, I don't know. I don't know why they'd select that. Well, the Hydroshock 9mm cartridge is one that is designed to expand on contact with flesh and expend all of the energy on that flesh. It doesn't go through people normally unless it's a very soft area. It's designed to expand and make a major wound out of any point it hits so that the person bleeds to death. He didn't mention this.
Hydroshock, by the way, if you're not familiar, if you ever shot a water jug, a plastic water jug with an expanding round, that jug doesn't get a hole in it. It just explodes because it creates a water or hydroshock, and that's the name then of the... Now, this is a firearms expert, a weapons expert.
This is the top police agency in our whole federal government, and their best police expert that came and gave that testimony.
You must have walked out with sore legs, because it sounded like this guy was pulling your leg the whole time he was testifying for the government on this stuff. We have seen so far the government's suppression of evidence. Did they or did they not, from a defense standpoint, attempt to call Janet Reno, Mr. Higgins, Mr. Sessions, and others to testify as to what had gone on in the pre-planning of this thing?
The prosecution, of course, did not call them. The defense changed their strategy. I understood that at one point they were planning on calling Janet Reno and William Sessions and the others. And very shortly after the prosecution had rested, the defense also rested. I think they called 4 witnesses before they simply stopped. They decided that there was not sufficient evidence to find their defendants guilty, and they just didn't want to expose them to any more cross-examination, and none of the defendants themselves took the stand.
How was the defense team? Were they good, bad, indifferent? DeGarian seems to have at least questionable contacts in this whole thing. Many of the things that he said he saw, he didn't report until after it was too late to verify them. He had been involved in the prosecution of Koresh, as I understand it, on an earlier occasion. Does this defense team look a little bit bizarre to you? I mean, is this...
Actually, the attorneys for the defense were both court-appointed and volunteer. I thought that they did as good a job as they could, considering that they were officers of the court. They all came away saying, yes, Judge Smith gave us a fair trial, but they all had to contend with working as officers of the court and continuing.
I need to back in and have you say that again. Maybe, Bruce, you want to comment here, too. A lawyer as officer of the court, that's a strange concept to most people, but it's important when you look at a case like this. This is a monopolistic, closed system, isn't it?
When you look at this situation, the government pays the prosecutors, the government pays the judge, the government paid the witnesses in this case. In almost all of the witnesses were government employees. The government paid the attorneys for the defense. Now this is a free enterprise economy that we're in, supposedly, and I just wonder how we could consider that that was possibly a fair trial.
Deck seems a little bit stacked at best, doesn't it, when everybody's on the same payroll against these few individuals here. One other point that I want to bring out, because it was stunning to me, the fact that there was a gag order placed on the defense team. What was this gag order about? Did that mean they couldn't communicate with each other? They couldn't communicate with the press? What exactly does this involve?
It meant that they couldn't communicate with the press. And although the attorneys were distressed about that, it didn't cause as much of a problem as you might imagine. You asked me previously about those attorneys, and I was satisfied with them as much as I could be, and some of them were outright sterling stars. They did very well. They proved that the government's witnesses in many cases were lying, and that's what you expect a good defense attorney to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, particularly when there's so much evidence.
When you say, Jack, that they proved that they were lying, were charges of perjury brought against these witnesses for lying?
Of course not.
See, the thing of it is, we've slipped so far away that things like that go right by us. The idea that somebody can lie and then walk away from the lie, be caught in the lie and say, oh, well, you can't enter that lie now because we caught you at it.
Can't be admitted as evidence because it's a lie.
It's fine. And the idea that all that evidence, even if it happens, and all of the evidence was collected incorrectly and so forth, that evidence is then removed from prosecuting the individual, which if the person actually did it, you don't want the person to go free just because somebody collected the information incorrectly. But instead of doing that, what happens is we end up with a situation where the officer gets his hand slapped because he didn't collect the information correctly, and the person who's guilty goes away free. Rather than trying them both separately, trying the government for what their misdeeds were, trying these individuals for their misdeeds separately and saying, who did what? But none of this happens.
You're precisely right, and following the 19th, when the memorial service is being held at Mount Carmel, the final memorial service 1 year following the, correction, I'd say April 19th, they are going to bulldoze that site completely. We've gone a full year and no independent investigator has ever touched that place.
Is the fencing still up around?
The fencing is still around the 5 acres where the building stood. But it seems to me just a terrible fraud against the American people to have promised, and we had promises from Mr. Stephanopoulos and from Janet Reno that an independent investigation would take place. We have had no independent investigation.
In the first place, we saw an illegal raid. We saw events that took place that were absolutely horrific. We saw that this was exactly to the day 50 years later, that the Nazis did the same thing to the Jews in the ghettos of Warsaw, Poland. Exactly 50 years to the day they also got burned alive, shot. We have seen a massive cover-up using the national media. We have also seen a trial that was as close to a high-tech lynching as a now Supreme Court justice once said as he stood before a fat, arrogant Congress defending himself. We have come about as close to tyranny in this situation, I think, as any of us have seen in our lifetimes. And yet the question remains, what's next? Where do we go from here? Do we go back to the America of our founding fathers? Or do we pursue the trail that we are on, which is being carefully laid with all kinds of bait and traps as we march down the road toward a police state and that now famous New World Order? This is life at the barrel of a gun. This is a gun not dissimilar from the AK-47 that was described as having the upper and lower chamber. As anyone can plainly see, there is only one place for a chamber on this weapon. You can't have an upper and lower, there is one. There's only one place for the bullets to be received, or a receiver, only one place to put in a clip, and yet it was this, the basis, in part at least, for a standoff that lasted 50-plus days, that cost close to 100 lives. We have seen the horrors of what went on. We have seen the mock trial examined. But I think more important than any of this, more important than the what could ever be, is the why. And where does it go from here? So that's what I want to take the next few minutes, gentlemen, to examine, is the what, and not the what, rather, but the why. And where do we go from here? Why Branch Davidian? Why are we seeing what we have seen? We saw a government agency run mad. In fact, perhaps the entire government go mad as they did this. The warrant was issued supposedly as a peaceful warrant service, yet that was never even attempted. Why? Bruce, why Waco? What is this about? Is this just an oops, or were we getting a message?
When government continually overrides the rights of the people, when they continually usurp power, exceed the boundaries which the Constitution places upon them, and they continue to do this, the only thing that they can look to do down the road and that we can expect to happen is increased usurpation of power, increased emphasis by the federal government. They are now into every area of life, even though the Constitution severely restricted them to only 17 areas of things that they could lawfully do. We now no longer have a lawful government, a de jure government. We now have an anarchical government. Law, they are totally outside of law.
Jack, if government no longer cares about U.S. law, they no longer care about this Constitution, this contract between we the people and those we send to govern, this limits what they can do on our behalf, on our stead. We have said this is a contract, go no further. But if that means nothing to people like Janet Reno, or Mr. Higgins, or Mr. Sessions, or Mr. Clinton, or Mr. Benson, what does that tell us as citizens? What should we take away from that? Is there a higher law that these people respond to? For instance, Lloyd Benson. We know that Lloyd Benson is not only Secretary of the Treasury, he's involved in the International Monetary Fund as one of the directors, as that's his position. That's a United Nations organization. If our law means nothing, is there perhaps another law that means something to these people?
The law that matters is God's law. And we have seen these things happen to the Randy Weaver family, to the Branch Davidians, because this nation has departed from God's law. This country was founded by godly persons, by godly men that established that Constitution you've been citing. But we have left the God of our fathers to worship materialism, security, entertainment, all of the things that preoccupy every American's life. And this includes the Christian Church of America, unfortunately.
I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, what's even more sad, what's even more disappointing is the fact that as we look at the situation at Waco, Texas, Christian media didn't pick up on this either, guys.
That's right.
They didn't
You're right.
talk about it either.
You're right.
We backed down from the issue as well. It's frightening to have to deal with this and with the prospects of what's going on, because as you look, the law that was obeyed here was not Yahweh's law, God's law. The law that was obeyed here was not the Constitution which binds them down, which is really not law. It's simply a contract between us and those we send to govern. That law wasn't obeyed, or that contract wasn't obeyed. In fact, everything that was done, the message that seems to have come out loud and clear is that, church, don't be different. Now again, I don't want to give the impression that I'm condoning that which David Koresh and his followers believed, because frankly, I've never had a chance to interview David Koresh. He was either dead or disappeared by the time I got down to Waco. So I can't either condone or condemn what he stood for, but that's not the point. The point is, church, don't be different. You do what the church historically has done, and of course, unfortunately, historically, we have disavowed the law of the Lord, the teachings of the Lord, and we have gone our own way. We were told, don't have guns, despite the fact the Constitution of the United States, in its Bill of Rights, says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. David Koresh and the others died for a weapon like this that supposedly had an upper and lower chamber. Such weapon that I know of does not exist. Again, I'm not a firearms expert, but I know what an AK-47 looks like. We acquired this one especially for this broadcast just to show it here, because they are so similar in design. There is no way. 86 people died for something, Bruce. A message came out of it. Don't be different. Don't keep guns. Interesting, isn't it, that the example we cited, exactly 50 years to the day, February 28, 1943, the Nazis come into the ghettos of Warsaw, Poland, a failed first attempt. April 19th, they burn them out, they shoot them, they kill everybody that lives, they pump in the gases, the whole thing identical. Fascinatingly, that night, April 19th, 1993, Bill Clinton stands before the opening of the Holocaust Memorial there, where exactly the same thing began, exactly 50 years to the day before that, and tells us we must remember. But we've already forgotten, haven't we? You see, I don't believe, gentlemen, that this is an accident. I think this has been planned. Bruce, I think we're stepping right in step with the New World Order. I've written about it in my latest book, Checkmate, The Game of Princes. We've talked about it. We've said that this is exactly what they're going to do because they've said this is exactly what they're going to do. How much further can we walk down this path before, fellas, it's all over? Any ideas?
Every opportunity to turn it around needs to be utilized. There is, within this country, a lawful means of doing that. And that lawful means is the fact that the Constitution is still intact, the fact that the law of the Lord still survives. And both of these things were the foundation on which this country was built, and the foundation to which we have to go back if we're going to turn it around.
What are some of the things that we as individuals can begin doing to, for instance, A, protect ourselves and our family and our homes, to begin bringing government back in line, to begin finding a way to see that courts can't be used by powerful individuals as a continuing cover-up tool? Jack, why don't we start with you?
Well, the courts have been in the habit of covering up. The fact that we, according to the media, had a victory in San Antonio, and we did have a measure of victory because we saw that the government did not get all that it wanted in its treacherous attempt to cover up the murder of these people by prosecuting the victims as if they were the murderers.
We prosecuted the victims while their assailants
Are going free.
well, not only going free, are testifying against them in the courts. It's a frightening, frightening prospect. Go ahead, I'm sorry I interrupted. It just...
Well, in Randy Weaver's trial, we experienced the same thing. The jury really was convinced that he should have gone free, that they didn't know that they were going to put him back in jail, and he served another, I guess, 3 months after he was found innocent of the charge of murder that he was initially, that they were trying to hang on him. So I think we need to let the media know that we don't trust them. We need to let our congressmen know, above all. I'm not sure that it does the thing we want it to do, because these congressmen are driven by their desire to get reelected. They're driven by being able to take home pork and trade that in for votes so that they can go back to Washington, because they like the ride that they're on. But nevertheless, I think we need to let them know, because it helps us to vent our feelings toward our government. And those feelings have to be vented, and we have to do it again and again. We have to tell those rascals that we want them to serve us instead of us serving them.
I think it's a step in the right direction. Obviously, we need to let our congressmen, we need to let our representatives know that we don't approve of what they're doing. But frankly, they've pretty much dealt with us with impunity anyway, because quite honestly, we spend 90% of our time, energy, and money lobbying to get them to do the right thing, when in most cases they are diametrically opposed to that for which we stand. I mean, look at the Brady bill. It passed by unanimous consent. Where was the opposition party? There was no opposition party. That, by the way, is unthinkable, that they would pass a law like this that controls all of the states everywhere in one sweeping motion. How many of us, how many million of us have written, said, you can't do this, it's unconstitutional. But where is our remedy? When we take them to the courts which they control, they say, no, wrong, it is constitutional. Bruce, what do? They own the courts. They've given themselves so many privileges in Congress, franking privileges, slush funds, money. They don't even have to have money in the bank to write checks on the House bank anymore. Well, of course, that's pretty much gone now, but they'll come up with something to replace it. What do? We can't beat them in court. What's next?
I think there's a lot of things that are being seen as being necessary for us to do. One is that we have to understand that we pursue this lawfully. We don't pursue this under the same guise that our government has under anarchy, where they throw the law out and do as they jolly well please.
I think that's an important point, because you don't fight anarchy with anarchy. You end up with a bunch of dead people when you do that.
The comments that were made about the Founding Fathers as they fought the American Revolution, one of the comments was that even though these people were at times with no government, they were never a people without government. There was a law that governed them and governed them inside, and as a result, they always did things by committees. They always did things by representation. They always did things in a lawful manner. They didn't take the law into their own hands. They always established courts. They always saw to it that justice was carried out. I think this is an important thing as we begin to deal with the things that have happened in our country. Yes, there's a point at which, and our Founding Fathers understood it in the unanimous declaration when they said that when any form of government, that the rights of the people were secured because they came from the Creator. And they were secured because government was established to see to it, not to change them, not to do away with those rights, but to keep them secure. And when any form of government became destructive of these ends, then it was the right of the people to alter or abolish it and form a new government. It's not that we need in this country to alter or abolish our government. Our Constitution is solid. It really can grant us the same freedoms it has in the past. But it won't happen until we begin putting people in office who understand what the Constitution is, as it says, not as some group of individuals somewhere else say it says, but as any 8th grader that sits down with a basic understanding of the English language and reads it, says this is what it says. Until we begin to do that, and there's always a problem of how do you do it? When they control the guns, they control the enforcement of law that is not really law. They don't even have the capacity. Jack mentioned it. These things were done under color of law. They're not done under true law. They're done under color of law. Law that they didn't have by lawful authority to make. See, there was an understanding that compelled our Founding Fathers to act the way they did in forming this free nation. And that was that there was a higher law. And this higher law they were always to be in submission to by conscience in every act that they carried out in their lives. And as a result of that submission to higher law, they never did things anarchical. And so we need to keep that in mind. We need to see to it that we have a way to defend ourselves against these abuses of power. James Madison wrote in a statement that he said, "It is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. We hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens, and one of the noblest characteristics of the late Revolution. The free men of America did not wait till usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise and entangled the question in precedence. That's what we saw with Waco. We have seen usurped power, and now the desire to make it precedent with Randy Weaver and now with Waco, and it'll continue on if we don't take alarm. Entangle the question in precedence. They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle. We revere this lesson too much soon to forget it. We need to remember that people are innocent until proven guilty, that people are not to be searched unless there's probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, unless a warrant is properly served and done in accordance with law and the protection of all of a person's rights. When we don't stand for these things and we let them slide by, the next cog comes down to forge the chains. And Patrick Henry saw that in the statement that he made when he finally said, you know, what more can we do? We need to petition our congressmen. We need to let them know that we see the truth. We need to inform them of the truth. But after they've been informed and they still don't respond, we need to pursue it even further in looking to those people and saying to them, if you don't do in accordance with the oath that you've taken, you will be removed from office, never to return. And because not only removed from office, but we need to begin to put penalties on those who violate their oath of office and violate their public trust. Most of the things that are placed under government, and James Madison was the chief architect of the Constitution. He debated the whole idea of, and one of the things that Jack was talking about with pork, is the idea that they get what they do and the acceptance of the people because they give them something. And as long as we continue to take those things, we become as much a violator of that principle as anybody else. We have got to get to the point where we begin to say no to government, no to their handouts, no to the provisions, no to the things that have happened. Take, for instance, H.R. 6 that just passed regarding education. The federal government says, if you don't accept our regulation of your school systems, accept our requirements for graduation, accept our teaching methodologies, accept our standardization, you'll lose your funding. If the people of the states would stand and say, keep your funding, and we'll keep control of our educational system, we'll keep control of these things. And then if the federal government continues in this vein, after they've been said no to by the states don't send the money anymore. I think that
so basically what you're talking about, Bruce, and we've only got maybe just a few more minutes left here, but you're talking about reasserting the sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty of the individual and of the state.
Yes.
Saying states stand up and say no. Listen, here's the foolishness that the states have bought into, guys. We send $1.50 to Washington and they send us $1 of services back.
That's right.
Now, Jack, I'm not a mathematician, but I can tell you this. If you give me $1.5 million and I only have to give you back $1 million, it's a pretty good deal for me. In fact, I'll do it with you all day long. But that's the ridiculous notion that we have bought with the federal government. We send in $1.5 million, they send us back $1 million. Or $1.5 billion and they send us back $1 billion.
Not only that, but it's even beyond that, because when they send it back to us, they tell us how we can spend it.
Yeah, they put strings on it then. And
they tell us how we're going to spend it.
And then they mandate, not only that they send back $1 billion, but they mandate we're going to have to spend $1.5 billion. So we've actually given them $2 billion for the $1 billion they've sent back. We're not very bright. It's time for us to stand up. What about the concept of constitutional courts? We don't have those operating now. Obviously, and look at Waco.
One of the things that happened, and with the right to trial by jury should be a trial by jury, not a trial by judge. A judge that steps in and says, you can't hear this evidence. You can't have these as jurors. You can't, I'm going to give a test to all your jurors to see what religious beliefs they have before you can be a juror.
Jack, that's a classic example of what happened in Waco, isn't it?
I would love to see a transcript of the grand jury's proceedings that indicted these Branch Davidians, yes. Especially those three that
they
were
should
not
be a matter
there.
of public record.
They should be a matter of public record. But you can rely on this fact. The grand jury that did the indicting was dictated to by the prosecution,
That's right.
by the government prosecutors. They told them what to do. We need independent grand juries again. Grand juries don't know what their responsibilities and authority is.
That's right. The fully informed jury needs to be, and that's a big push right now, to see to it that jurors, when they go, understand they're to conduct
They
the
have a
trial.
right to try the law,
And
the
the
application of the law, and then the fact.
That's right.
What about in terms of personal protection? What can we do? For instance, these folks in Waco, they were isolated. Randy Weaver is a perfect case of an isolated individual. But this happens hundreds of times, not just once in a while, hundreds of times each year across this country. What can citizens do? What can just normal, everyday guys and families do to begin protecting themselves?
One of the things I think that a lot of people, and law enforcement agents also have a concern for this, that we don't have a lot of people running around with weapons, shooting up neighborhoods, going on a spree,
That's
trying
already
to
going
track
on right
down,
now.
doing these. I know, but I mean, under the idea of the average citizen going out and just saying, I'm going to stop crime in my neighborhood, I'm going to shoot everybody I think that's doing it. Not doing it in that fashion, but at the same time,
Again, not anarchy.
not anarchy. And that was the idea that the Constitution provided with the militia. The militia was to be well-trained, well-regulated, and adequate in every community for the defense of that community.
Against not only the foreign enemies, but domestic enemies,
That's right.
including government gone mad or local thugs.
That's right. The Constitution says that Congress has the authority or the power to call forth the militia for three things: to enforce the laws of the Union. And in the state of Florida, it's the same way, to enforce the laws of the state of Florida. In most states, it's the same way. To suppress insurrection and to repel invasion. Well, to the state of Florida, the federal government can sometimes become invasionary if they come down here and want to put powers upon us, which we have not delegated to them to do. That's an invasionary force. They have only the authority we've granted them and no more. The same thing is true within the state. If there would be people within the state who would rise up against the lawful authority of government and the carrying out of law, that the people need to be able to defend themselves against that as well. That crime, the protection of people's homes, all of these things compel us now to do something. Otherwise, we're going to end up a police
And this
state.
is not going to end up in opposition to local police or
No,
local...
in support of.
It would be in support of, so that, for instance, next time there was a flood or some hurricane victims or earthquake victims in whatever part of the country you live in, instead of having FEMA with all of their mass martial law come in, the local militia could stand up and say, we're here to help local law enforcement. We are here to help rebuild homes. We are here to help rebuild the lives of the people. These are our neighbors. We'll take care of them. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. The militia was the means by which people defended themselves, their homes, their communities, and so forth. In fact, the whole idea of the posse was just that. You didn't need to have a large law enforcement body, because when a sheriff had a warrant to serve or something like that, he'd pull from the militia a posse. And he would say, you'll get paid to go out and help me do this until this is enforced and this is done. Then you go back to doing your own lives. Because within the community, everybody was participating in that. Kennesaw, Georgia, had made an interesting proposition to the people of the United States when they said, hey, everybody in this whole area will be armed, every home. Crime dropped drastically.
89%, by the way, 89% crime
Switzerland, we hold up as being probably the bastion of peace and of non-involvement in countries and non-partisan and so forth. But every household is armed. Why? Against the law? No. In defense of the law. To see to it that the law will not be overridden or overtrodden by anybody, whether they be a criminal or whether they be a criminal under color of law serving in the government.
Because criminal activity, whether you wear a government's hat or not, whether your jacket says BATF or ATF police or agent, or whether it says Treasury Department or whatever it says, a violation of law is a violation of law, particularly when it's a violation of eternal law. When rights, unalienable, those not granted by government, granted by our eternal Creator and endowed into man, start to be removed by government and by the hand of government, we have a pretty good idea that government has decided that they are God, that they control every aspect of our lives, and that's a dangerous position to be in. It is that very premise that brought our founding fathers from the pulpits to the battlefield. Hopefully, this time around, we're going to be wise enough to say no more. Because whether we want to admit it or not, government is really a much larger entity than any of us perhaps even knows, because we know that for the last at least almost century, every president, every Congress, and every cabinet appointee has been carefully screened and positioned by powerful forces working behind the scenes to make all of this a reality as we build toward this new world order that Revelation has talked so much about. But the good news is that the Lord never intended for nation states to be ruined or dissolved. He always makes a way of escape. He lists it in His Word. The pages of history are replete with those examples, and each of us, in our own way, can now begin to participate. Folks, I believe that we are moving into the last of the last times. I think that it's undeniably true that the new world order that George Bush popularized, that Bill Clinton fully supports, is marching on. We have before us choices. We can, by the choices that we make, determine the destiny of this nation. You see, if we don't judge sin, sin will judge us. Sin is judging this nation. We've had floods in the Midwest of historic proportion. Fires, earthquakes, landslides, and floods on the West Coast. Florida has had hurricanes and tornadoes and unprecedented flooding and drought, all at the same time. The Northeast has been battered by snows and drought and heat and everything you can think of. 86 people are dead as government has gone mad near Waco, Texas. The last book of Scripture tells us that we are to be different. We are to be the called out ones, not the church with a small c, but the church with a big C, the ecclesia, the called out ones, to be different. John, speaking for the Lord, commands us, "Come out of her, my people." Folks, there are only two categories as we come down now to this day and to this time. All of us have been scurrying about so busily looking for the mark of the beast that we have forgotten there's only one way to keep from taking it, and that is by taking the mark of the Lord. It is time again that we understood what a true patriot is. Patriot is one who knows Yeshua, the Messiah, Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, and who understands that divine law is eternal. You can deny it, but not repudiate it. It will always exist. It is time that we understood there's only one way for this nation to be turned back to greatness, to be coming out of the system of the beast, to keep from going into that Orwellian, horrible new world order where incidents like Waco will be common. And that is for each of us to make a personal commitment to begin again that way of righteous living that is the beginning of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, all of which we are going to need if we're to have any hope of solving the problems of this nation. We have seen the horrors of Waco. We have seen the sham trial. We have seen the media cover-up. We have seen the U.S. military used on innocent civilians. Folks, if you're going to try and fight this in the flesh, we've already lost. There is only one power great enough to stop what's going on, and that's an eternal God, Creator, the divine sovereign of the universe, Yahweh Himself. It is to Him that each of us must now begin looking. And then, understanding that this is a spiritual movement that must result in political action, each of us then has to become accountable for what is going on in our city, county, state, and nation. We can no longer turn a blind eye to the Randy Weavers and the Wacos. It's time to stand up and be counted, but stand up and be counted this day for righteousness. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of the Baker Report. I hope you've enjoyed it. At least I hope you've been informed by it. If nothing else, hopefully, we have spurred you today to begin taking the action, the spiritual action, that is necessary if this nation is to survive. Good night, and thanks for being a part of this special report.
This book, Checkmate, is the first time I've seen all of the studies that I've made over the years pulled together under one title with pure documentation, and it's all there in one piece with great authoritative value. And this is why I'm excited about Checkmate. It's a remarkable piece of work.
My objective in more than 40 years of public speaking has been to get people to laugh, think, and read. When I began reading Checkmate, Game of Princes, I couldn't put it down. It was the most alarming, enlightening reading experience of my life. I urge you to buy and read the book. It'll change your life.
Most Americans I know have heard so much about the New World Order, but really don't know what it's all about at all. After reading Checkmate, I was informed on what the New World Order is really about. At first I was frightened, but now I realize just what we can do about it. Checkmate, The Game of Princes, is a book that people should take time and read.
Our special thanks to all of the people that have helped make this program possible. Why would someone like former Supreme Court Justice William Goodloe agree to come on camera? Why would somebody of the caliber of a Don McIlvaney agree to come on camera and talk about these types of things on a program like this? I think because they too realize the urgency of what's going on. They too have been involved in the research to find out what this New World Order is all about. And frankly, that's why I've prepared these materials, and that's why I wrote Checkmate, The Game of Princes. It started out over 850 pages that have been edited down now to 350 pages. What is left is what we consider the pure gold. Over 5 years of research, thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of documentation, hundreds and hundreds of books and research documents. Why? Because I think before us, we're seeing prophecy unfolding. And I think we, as Christian Americans, need to know what's going on. We need to understand the crisis we face. But more importantly, we need to understand the answers. And that's what Checkmate, The Game of Princes, is about. It's not about the end of America. It's about the end of the Game of Princes. You see, there is a way we can stop what's going on. Checkmate, The Game of Princes is that blueprint. It is the paint-by-numbers course to end it, to stop it in its tracks. That's why we put this entire package together. That's why we've got the AIDS tapes in there, so that you'll know how to protect yourself and your family. We didn't put them in there to scare you. We put them in there to give you answers. That's why we put the pocket version of the U.S. Constitution in, so that you can know what it says. That's why we prepared this special white paper report on the government's attack on personal and financial privacy. Did you know that last year there were over 500,000 confiscations of private property, and in over 80% of these cases, the people were either never charged with a crime, or the charges were so flimsy that they immediately had to be thrown out. Walking through airports, people are now being stopped, their money confiscated, their lives turned upside down and ruined. You think it can't happen to you? Ask the 500,000 people that it happened to just last year. And now, to top it all off, our government is paying watchdog fees to neighbors, to friends, to relatives, to let them know what's going on. Big Brother is starting to watch. Folks, this is something we need to take seriously. This is something we need to understand, something from which we need to protect ourselves. That's why we wrote the special white paper report, The Government's Attack on Personal and Financial Privacy. You see, there are ways to protect yourself, your family, and your estate. There are ways, if you will, to hide in plain sight. I'm not talking about going underground and living in a cave. We're talking about hiding in plain sight, blending into the crowd, so that what you have is protected, so that what you have is not going to be somehow confiscated under some new strange money laundering law or new drug law. You see, now the drug laws are even being used so that if someone is caught on your property with drugs, they can confiscate your home, your car, your business, your bank account. They can take your kids away from you. But there's a way to protect yourself. Frankly, that's why we've created Checkmate, the Game of Princes, and this entire package of materials. I know the price seems awfully low to many people. They wonder why we're not charging more, but folks, this is what I do. I'm trying to warn America. I'm trying to tell you what's going on before it's too late. I'm trying to let you know before you end up like the gentleman in Florida who he and his son are now both serving 18 months in prison for putting clean fill dirt on a quarter-acre lot they owned. You see, these things are happening right here in America, and you need to understand it. This isn't far away, Never Never Land. Again, you see all of the military equipment around. This is a war, but we need to start fighting the war. We haven't even been fighting it. The lines are being drawn right now. The remnant is being called out, and I think each of us is going to have to make a decision. Which way are we going to go? I need you now to protect yourself. Pick up the phone and make that call now. You need to know what's going on. You need to know how to protect yourself. It's important. It's important to me, and it's important to you.
This exclusive TV offer is available now for the exceptionally low price of $29.95 plus shipping and handling. You'll receive the book Checkmate, 2 audio tapes on AIDS, the Politics of Death, plus a confidential government report and a pocket copy of the U.S. Constitution. Have your credit card ready and call the 1-800 number today, or send your check or money order to Checkmate, 4275 34th Street South, number 150, St. Petersburg, Florida, 33711. Order this important package today.